Welcome, dear friends. I have a special request for you. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and be part of our growing community. Your support means a lot. My name doesn't really matter for this story, but the shape of my life might. So let me start there, at the beginning, in the small house at the end of a quiet street where the wind used to rattle the aluminum siding every winter, and where I first learned that there were certain things about myself I was supposed to keep quiet. I was the middle child of three, the only boy, sandwiched between an older sister who treated me like a living doll and a younger sister who treated me like a rival, and from the earliest age I can remember, I understood that the world had already prepared a script for me. Boys wore blue. Boys played rough. Boys did not cry when they scraped their knees. Boys grew up to be men. And men, in the town where I grew up, were a very specific kind of creature, quiet, sturdy, uncomplaining, useful. My father was that kind of man. He worked at a factory 40 minutes away, came home smelling of engine oil and cold air, ate his dinner in silence, watched the news, and went to bed. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't warm either. He was simply present, the way a piece of old furniture is present, and I loved him with the confused, aching love that children reserve for parents they don't fully understand. My mother, by contrast, filled the house with movement and sound, always cooking, always folding, always talking on the phone in low tones about people I didn't know, and it was from her orbit that my first memory of the thing I could not name emerged, when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I wandered into her bedroom while she was out, and I saw her scarves hanging on the back of the door, silk and cotton and one dark green wool one with tiny embroidered flowers, and something about them, called to me in a language I did not yet have words for. I remember standing on my tiptoes and pulling the green one down, and I remember wrapping it around my shoulders, and I remember looking in the mirror and feeling, for the first time in my short life, a quiet click of rightness, as if a bone that had been slightly out of place had settled back into its socket. I did not have language for what I felt. I only knew that I did not want to take it off. And I also knew, in the way that children know things they have not been taught, that I must never let anyone see me like this. So I folded the scarf carefully and put it back and went outside to ride my bicycle, and I told no one, not even myself, not really. That is where it begins, I think, with a scarf and a mirror and a small boy who understood shame before he understood the word for it. For years afterward, I did what I imagine many children in my position do, which is to build 2 lives inside one body. There was the life that everyone could see, in which I played on the Pee Wee soccer team and learned to fish with my uncle and got into wrestling matches with my cousins at Thanksgiving and did all the things a boy in that place was expected to do, and I did them not badly, not brilliantly, just competently enough that no one ever asked whether I actually wanted to be doing them. And then there was the other life, the invisible one, in which I studied my sisters and my mother and my aunts the way a scholar studies a text, memorizing the way they held their teacups, the way they crossed their legs when they sat, the way they tilted their heads when they were listening, the way they laughed with one hand covering their mouths. I was not trying to be them. I want to be very clear about that, because for a long time I told myself that I was just curious, that I was just observant, that this was normal. But the truth is that I was gathering. I was collecting pieces of a self that I did not yet know how to assemble. In the quiet hours when everyone else was asleep or out, I would occasionally sneak into my older sister's room and try on one of her hair clips, just for a moment, and then take it off with trembling fingers and put it back exactly where I had found it, and my heart would pound so hard I could hear it in my ears, and the shame would rush in like a tide and drown whatever small pleasure I had felt, and I would swear to myself I would never do it again. I broke that promise more times than I can count. By the time I was 12, I had built a very thorough understanding of my own hiddenness. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew which drawers made noise when they slid open. I knew how long my mother's shopping trips usually took and how much warning I would have if she came home early. I had become, without ever meaning to, an expert in my own secret, and the expertise itself was a kind of loneliness, because a secret is a companion who never lets you rest. It was around this age that I first came across the word crossdresser in a magazine at the barbershop, tucked into a small, sneering article about a celebrity scandal, and I remember the specific temperature of my face as I read it, the way the heat crawled up from my collar to my hairline. So there was a word for it, and the word was ugly. The word was a punchline. The word belonged to men who were laughed at, men who were pitted, Men who were in the vocabulary of my town, not really men at all. I closed the magazine, and I did not touch my mother's scarves for almost a year after that, and I threw myself into being the most ordinary boy I could possibly be. I joined the football team, though I was too small for it. I started listening to the music my cousins listened to, though I did not really like it. I began speaking in a lower register than my natural voice, and I practiced walking with my shoulders squared, and I forced myself to develop opinions about cars and about girls, though I understood neither. This is, I think, one of the most important things I want anyone listening to understand about what these years were like, and I want to speak carefully here because I know some people watching may be going through something similar right now. When you spend your childhood performing a version of yourself that you do not recognize in the mirror, you do not simply become tired. You become a stranger to your own interior. You lose the ability to distinguish between what you want and what you're supposed to want. You begin to make choices not because they are yours, but because they will produce the correct evidence in the eyes of others, and eventually the evidence becomes the only real thing about you, and the person underneath becomes a kind of ghost. That is what happened to me through my teenage years, and it is what happens, I suspect, to a great many people who carry hidden parts of themselves through a world that has told them those parts are unacceptable. High school passed in a blur of borrowed personalities. I dated a girl named Rachel in my sophomore year, a kind and cheerful person who deserved a much better boyfriend than I was capable of being, and I remember one evening we were sitting in her family's living room watching a movie, and she was wearing an oversized cardigan of her mother's, and I found that I was not looking at her face or her hands, but at the cardigan itself, at the drape of it, at the way the sleeves fell over her wrists, and I felt a longing so pure and so misplaced that I had to excuse myself and go stand in her bathroom until I could breathe again. I did not want Rachel. I wanted, if I am honest, to be a person who could wear that cardigan without shame. And I did not yet know how to hold that thought without it burning me. When Rachel broke up with me a few months later, telling me gently that I seemed far away from her most of the time, I told her she was right and that I was sorry, and I meant it. I could not tell her the true reason, because I did not yet know how to say it even to myself. I graduated. I went to a state university about 3 hours away. I chose engineering because it was the kind of major that would make my father nod approvingly, and I did well enough at it. And for the first 2 years of college, I lived in a small dorm room with a roommate who barely spoke to me, and I began, very cautiously, to explore. I bought my first pair of women's clothing from a thrift store 2 towns over, paying in cash, feeling like a criminal, and I hid the bag under my mattress and did not open it for 3 days because I was terrified that just owning it was already too much. When I finally did open it, alone, at night, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, and I put on the simple black skirt and the soft gray sweater I had bought, and I looked at myself in the small mirror above my desk, I did not feel triumph. I felt grief. I felt the accumulated weight of every year I had spent not doing this, every year I had spent pretending, every hour I had spent policing my own posture and my own voice and my own gaze. I sat on the edge of my bed in that skirt and that sweater, and I cried, quietly, so my roommate would not hear if he came back early, and I understood for the first time that whatever this was, it was not a phase. It was not a curiosity. It was a part of me that had been waiting, patient and hungry, for permission to exist. I would like to say that this revelation set me free. It did not. What it did was open a door into a much longer and much more difficult corridor because now I knew, and knowing is heavier than not knowing, and I had no one to tell and no framework for understanding what I had found. In the months that followed, I began to do what I now think of as my apprenticeship. I read. I read everything I could find, at first in libraries and later, once I got a computer of my own, online. I read about crossdressing, and I read about transgender identity, and I read about gender nonconformity, and I read the stories of other people who had felt what I felt, and slowly, very slowly, I began to build a vocabulary. I learned that the umbrella was wider than I had known, that there were many people who dressed and lived across the range of gender for many different reasons, some of whom identified as men who simply liked wearing women's clothes, some of whom identified as women who had been assigned male at birth, some of whom lived somewhere in between and were content there, some of whom had no fixed answer and were content with that too. What I did not immediately know, and what took me years to work out, was which of these I was. I want to pause here to say something that I think matters a great deal, especially for anyone who is at the beginning of a journey like this. There is enormous pressure, both from inside and from outside, to sort yourself quickly, to arrive at a label and plant a flag, and be done with the confusion. That pressure is a lie. It took me a long time to understand that identity is not a puzzle you solve once and file away. It is a conversation you have with yourself, over years, sometimes over decades, and the honest answer sometimes changes, and the honest answer is sometimes uncertain, and that uncertainty is not a failure. It is a form of respect for the complexity of being a person. I did not know all of this at 20. I only knew that I was standing at the edge of something enormous, and that I did not have a map. I met my wife, whom I will call Elena, in the last year of college, in a shared elective on ethics of all things, and I noticed her first because she disagreed with the professor about something and did it kindly, without any heat, and I thought at the time that I had never seen someone hold a difficult position with such gentleness. We started studying together, and then we started eating together, and then one night she asked me if I wanted to walk with her along the river that runs through the campus, and we walked for hours, and I remember thinking that I had never in my life felt so safe with another human being. That night, I did not tell her about the skirt in my drawer, or the sweater, or any of it. I did not tell her for a very long time. That is a decision I will spend a portion of this story unpacking because it is the ethical center of my life, the place where I made a choice that I still think about, and I want to be honest about both what I did and what I have learned from it. Elena and I dated through the end of college and for 2 years after, and we moved to a mid-sized city where I took a job at a small engineering firm and she began teaching middle school science, and we rented a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building with wooden floors that groaned under our footsteps, and I loved her. I really did, with the whole of the self I was letting her see. What I did not tell her, and what I told myself was harmless because I told myself I had it under control, was that I still, sometimes, on days when she was away visiting her parents or on a long field trip with her students, took the clothes out of the back of my closet and wore them for a few hours in the apartment, alone, and looked at myself in the full-length mirror in our bedroom and felt that old, quiet click of rightness, and then put everything away and became again the person she thought I was. I told myself this was a small compromise, a private thing that harmed no one, a personal matter that did not affect our marriage. I want to say very clearly, because I think it is one of the most important lessons I can offer to anyone in a similar position, that I was wrong. I was not wrong to have the need. I was not wrong to wear the clothes. I was wrong to keep it from her. I was wrong because a marriage is not a set of separate rooms with locked doors between them. A marriage is a house you build together, and you cannot build a house honestly if you are also, on the side, building a hidden basement that your partner does not know exists. Even if what you are doing in that basement is beautiful and good and hurts no one, the hiddenness itself is a kind of harm, because it creates a country inside your life where your partner cannot follow you, and slowly, over time, that country grows, and the shared country of your marriage grows smaller, and one day you look up and realize you have been living apart in the same rooms. I did not understand any of this in the early years. I was too frightened, and I was too used to hiding, and I told myself that the alternative, telling her, was worse than the compromise I had constructed. I imagined, in the small dark theater of my mind, every possible version of her reaction, and in almost all of them, she left me. She looked at me with disgust. She told her family. She told my family. My father found out and stopped speaking to me. My mother cried on the phone. My sisters exchanged looks over holiday dinners. I lost my job because someone at work heard. I became, in these imagined futures, exactly the punchline I had read about in that magazine at the barbershop when I was 12. The fear was so specific and so vivid that it felt like memory rather than prediction, and it kept me quiet for years. What finally changed things was not a dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of small ones. Elena began, gently, to ask me if something was wrong. She said I seemed distant sometimes. She said I sometimes looked at her as if from very far away. She said that on certain evenings, especially the evenings after she came back from a trip, I was strangely careful with her, as if I were tiptoeing around something I did not want her to see. She was, of course, right. She was right in the way that a good and attentive partner is always right about the shape of the person they love, even when they cannot name the specific content of what they are sensing. And I began to understand that my careful, hidden compromise was not actually harmless. It was slowly making her doubt herself. It was making her wonder if she was somehow the problem, if she was somehow failing to reach me, if there was some flaw in her that made me pull away. That understanding was the beginning of the end of my silence, because I could tolerate my own suffering in a way that I could not tolerate hers, and I realized that the price of my secret was being paid by both of us, not just me, and that it was not fair, and that no amount of internal calculation could make it fair. I decided, over the course of several months, that I was going to tell her. I did not know how. I read accounts online of other people who had told their partners, and I noticed that the ones who seemed to have gone best had certain things in common. They had been calm. They had been prepared to listen more than they spoke. They had not tried to justify or explain too much at first. They had made clear that they were not asking their partner to accept anything immediately, only to know. They had, above all, told the truth without dressing it up in either apologies or defenses, because a person receiving difficult news deserves to have the news itself, unadorned, and to be given the space to have their own reaction rather than being managed into a scripted one. I practiced what I would say. I practiced it in the car on my drive home from work. I practiced it in the shower. I practiced it in the mirror, sometimes wearing the clothes I intended to tell her about, sometimes not. I chose a Saturday evening in late autumn, when we had no plans and no obligations the next day, and I made her favorite dinner, which was a simple pasta with butter and sage, and after we had eaten and were sitting on the couch with the lamps low, I asked her if I could tell her something that was hard for me to say, and she looked at me with an expression I will never forget, which was not fear but readiness, as if she had been waiting for a long time for a door to open. I told her about the scarf when I was 5, and the barbershop magazine when I was 12, and the thrift store when I was 20, and everything after. I told her about the closet and the mirror and the years of hiding. I told her that I did not know exactly what I was, that I did not know whether I was a man who liked to dress as a woman sometimes or a woman who had been living as a man or something else entirely, and that I had been afraid to find out because I had been afraid of losing her. I told her I was sorry that I had kept it from her for so long. I told her that I did not expect her to know how to feel, and that I did not need her to have an answer that night, or the next week. I told her only that I wanted to stop being a stranger to her, that the cost of my hiding had grown larger than the cost of being seen. And then I stopped talking and I waited, and the waiting was the longest silence of my life. She did not speak for what felt like a very long time. And then she took my hand. She did not squeeze it or stroke it. She just held it, in her steady, warm, familiar way, and she said, in a voice that was quiet but not shaky, "Thank you for telling me. I don't know what this means yet, but I don't want you to be alone with it anymore." That was the beginning of the second half of my life. I want to be careful not to tell this next part as a fairy tale, because it was not one. The weeks after that conversation were some of the most difficult weeks of our marriage. Elena was, as I had known she would be, a thoughtful and generous person, but she was also a human being who had just been told that the man she had been married to for years had been carrying a secret for the entirety of their relationship, and that carried its own grief for her, its own loss, its own reckoning. She had questions I could not answer. She wanted to know why I had not trusted her sooner. She wanted to know what else I had not told her. She wanted to know if I was going to want to live differently, if our life together was going to change, if the person she had thought she was building a future with was still that person or someone else entirely. Some of her questions I could answer. Many of them I could not. What I could do was be present for the not knowing and be honest about what I did know, and let her have her feelings without trying to talk her out of them or hurry her through them. We started seeing a therapist together, a woman who specialized in couples navigating disclosures of this kind. And I want to say something here about the value of professional help, because I think a lot of people in stories like mine skip past this part or treat it as a footnote. The therapist did not fix us. She was not magic. What she did was hold the room while we talked to each other, and interrupt us gently when we started to spiral, and remind us of things we already knew but had temporarily forgotten in the intensity of our feelings. She helped us understand that Elena's grief was not a rejection of me, but a natural response to a significant realignment of her understanding of our shared life, and that my guilt was not a virtue, but a form of self-absorption that could actually make it harder for Elena to process what she needed to process. She helped us learn to sit with uncertainty without turning it into an emergency. If you are considering telling a partner something difficult, or if a partner has recently told you something difficult, and if you have the means to do so, please consider seeking that kind of help. It is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of taking the situation seriously. Over the months that followed, Elena and I began, tentatively, to build a version of our life that had room in it for the parts of me that had been hidden. We did this slowly. There was no grand reveal, no dramatic transformation. What there was, instead, was a series of very small, very ordinary conversations. She asked me one evening if I wanted to wear something of hers, just to see her reaction, and I said yes, and I did, and she looked at me for a long time, and she said, "You look like you. Not, you look like a woman. Not, you look strange. Just, you look like you." That was, I think, the most generous sentence anyone has ever said to me because it did not try to categorize what she was seeing. It simply acknowledged that what she was seeing was, in some important way, more accurate than what she had been seeing before. Over the next year, we bought me some clothes of my own, not many, just a few things that fit and that I liked, and we found a name that I sometimes used when I wore them, a name I will not share here because it belongs to me and to her and to the small circle of people we have chosen to trust. I did not, then or later, feel a clear pull to transition medically. I want to be careful how I say this, because I know that for many people the path forward from a moment like the one Elena and I shared is exactly a medical transition, and that path is right and true and life-saving for them, and I have deep respect for it. For me, the honest answer, after much reflection and much conversation both with Elena and with the therapist and later with a support group I joined, was that I was something more like a person who lived in a wider place than the narrow country of manhood I had been assigned to, and that the shape of my life that felt most true was one in which I could move within that wider place freely, sometimes presenting one way, sometimes another, without needing to permanently relocate. I say this not to argue that this is the right path for anyone else. I say it only because I think it is important for people to hear that there are many valid answers to the question of who you are, and that finding your own answer, whatever it is more important than matching the shape of anyone else's. There were harder conversations still to come. We had to decide, eventually, what to tell our families. My father, as I had feared for years, was the hardest part of it. I did not tell him everything. I told him only that I sometimes wore clothes that were not typically considered men's clothes, and that Elena knew and was supportive, and that I wanted him to know because I did not want to hide things from him anymore. He did not say much. He looked at his hands for a long time. He asked if I was still going to keep my job. I said yes. He asked if Elena and I were all right. I said yes. He nodded. He did not say he understood. He did not say he approved. He did not say much of anything, really. But at Christmas that year, he gave me, along with the usual practical gift of a good pair of work gloves, a small package wrapped in newspaper, and inside was a soft, dark green scarf, silk and cotton mixed, with tiny embroidered flowers along the edge. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. I understood that in his quiet, limited, deeply loving way, he had done the best he could, and that his best was more than I had ever dared to hope for. My mother cried when I told her, and she asked a number of questions that were not the questions I would have chosen for her to ask, and there was a period of some months during which our conversations were more careful than they had been, and then, slowly, we found our way back to a version of our closeness that was different from the old one, but perhaps more honest. My sisters, in their different ways, were kind. My younger sister asked if she could go shopping with me sometime, and I said yes, and we did, and it was ordinary and pleasant and unremarkable, which was itself a kind of miracle. My older sister said only, "I always felt like there was something you were carrying. I'm glad you don't have to carry it alone anymore." At work, I chose not to disclose. I want to speak honestly about that choice too, because I know some listeners may be facing similar decisions. There is no universal right answer about whether to be open about a hidden part of yourself in every context of your life. It depends on the culture of your workplace, on the strength of your legal protections where you live, on the stability of your position, on your own readiness, on many other factors. For me, at the firm where I worked, I judged that the value of disclosure was lower than the risk, and that I could live authentically in the parts of my life that mattered most to me, my marriage, my friendships, my family, without needing to bring every part of myself to the office. That is a decision I have made and remade over the years, and it may change in the future, and I do not think it makes me a hypocrite. I think it makes me a person navigating a complicated world with the resources I have. What I will say is that the hiding at work is entirely different in weight from the hiding at home that I used to do, because the people whose knowledge of me matters most know, and being known by them has changed everything. I want to talk in this last stretch of the story about what changed inside me after all of this, because I think that is finally the point of telling a story like this, and it is the thing I most want anyone listening to take away. What changed first was that the exhausting doubleness went away. The energy I had spent for decades on maintaining a divided self became available for other things. I did not become a different person exactly. I became a less tired person. I became a person who could listen to a friend's problems without half of my mind being occupied by the scanning, always the scanning that a hidden person does. Am I sitting right? Am I speaking right? Is my shirt too fitted? Does my voice sound wrong today? Did that person just look at me strangely? All of that scanning, which I had thought was simply the background noise of being alive, turned out to have been the specific noise of hiding, and when the need for hiding decreased, so did the noise, and in the quiet that followed, I began to hear my own thoughts more clearly than I ever had. What changed, second, was my marriage. I want to be careful not to romanticize this either. Elena and I have had difficult years since. We have had ordinary marital problems, financial worries, disagreements about where to live, small resentments that grew and had to be tended to, all the things that any long marriage contains. But underneath all of that has been a foundation that we did not have in the first years, which is the knowledge that we have already survived the hardest conversation we know how to have, and that we survived it not by pretending it away, but by walking into it together. When you have done that with someone once, you carry the memory of it into every difficulty that follows, and it makes you braver. Elena and I have often said to each other in the years since that if we could get through that, we can get through most things, and so far that has proven true. She has become, in ways I did not know how to imagine when I first told her, my perfect partner, not because she indulges me or performs any particular role for me, but because she sees me. And being seen, I have come to understand, is what the whole endless project of a life is about. What changed, third, was my relationship to other people who carry hidden things. I began, once I had processed my own experience enough to have any room in myself for anyone else's, to notice how many people around me were carrying secrets of one kind or another. Not the same secret as mine, necessarily. Different secrets. A colleague who was quietly caring for a mother with dementia and had told no one. A neighbor who was in recovery from an addiction that had cost her a decade of her life. A friend who had been sexually abused as a child and had never spoken about it to anyone. I do not mean to equate these things or to suggest that everyone's hidden burden is the same. They are not. But I began to understand that the specific texture of hiddenness, the tiredness, the scanning, the feeling of being a stranger in your own life, is a very common human condition, and that one of the most valuable things a person who has come out the other side of it can do is be the kind of person to whom other people can, if they choose, tell the truth. I try now to be that kind of person. I do not always succeed. But I try. What changed, fourth and finally, was my understanding of what it means to be responsible. When I was younger and more frightened, I thought responsibility meant maintaining the version of myself that the people around me expected, no matter what it cost me on the inside. I thought responsibility was a kind of self-suppression practiced for the benefit of others. I do not think that anymore. I think, now, that responsibility is something more difficult and more mutual than that. Responsibility means being honest with the people whose lives are entangled with yours, so that they can make real choices with real information rather than false choices with false information. Responsibility means doing the work to understand yourself so that you are not, without meaning to, making other people carry the weight of your unexamined life. Responsibility means being patient with other people while they process things that are difficult for them, even when their pace is slower than you would like. Responsibility means recognizing that your freedom to be yourself does not exempt you from the ordinary duties of love and friendship and citizenship, and that in fact those duties become more possible, not less, when you are living from a true center rather than a false one. There is one more thing I want to say before I close, and it is the thing I most wish someone had said to me when I was young. If you are carrying something like what I carried and you are frightened and you are certain that being known would cost you everything, please consider the possibility that you are wrong about the arithmetic. I do not mean that everyone in your life will respond well. Some of them will not. I lost a friend in the years after I began to be more open who could not accept what I told him, and that loss was real and it hurt. But I did not lose everything, and I did not lose the things that mattered most. And even the losses I did sustain were smaller and more bearable than the slow, invisible loss of myself that I had been sustaining for decades in the name of safety. Hiding is not free. It is one of the most expensive things a person can do with a life. It costs you your energy, your clarity, your intimacy, your capacity to be present, and eventually, if you keep it up long enough, it costs you the memory of who you were before you started hiding. That is a price I paid for many years without knowing I was paying it, and I would like to save someone else from paying it if I can. Whatever the specific shape of the self you are keeping quiet, I hope you find, in your own time and in your own way, someone safe to tell. I hope you find a therapist or a group or a friend or a partner or even a journal if that is where you have to start. I hope you find a mirror that lets you see yourself without flinching. I hope you find a green scarf, or its equivalent in your own life, and I hope you find a father who, in his own limited way, is trying. I hope you find an Elena. I hope, most of all, that you find yourself, and that when you do, you are gentler with the person you find than the world has taught you to be. That is my story, or as much of it as I know how to tell in the time we have had together. It is not a story of transformation in the dramatic sense, and it is not a story of triumph. It is a story of a person who spent a long time being afraid to be a person, and who, with a great deal of help from a great many people, finally learned how. There is more of the story still to come, because I am still alive and still learning, and there will be new chapters one cannot yet see. But this is the shape of the ground I stand on now, and I wanted to share it with you, in case any of it is useful. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.